If you'd like to take a seat for our final session, and I'd like to just introduce this final panel session. My name is Nigel Gilbert, and very shortly I shall shut up and sit down. But before then, let me tell you what this is all about. Actually, what it's about is not what it says on the program. What it's about is that famous statement by Michael Gove: "Britain has had enough of experts," says Gove, to quote the Financial Times headline, which started it all off. The official topic, as you will read in the program, is "Brokers and boundary spanners, where next for evidence and experts at the food, water, energy nexus." And we have a really interesting and distinguished panel to discuss that. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves very briefly. I'm then going to ask each of them to make a short statement relating to that issue. And then I will open up the discussion to you, to the room. We are going to finish on the time, at the time it says on the agenda. That's, although we're starting rather late, so that we can make sure that you have sufficient time to, well, as the euphemism says, to network. Well, actually means to drink, but okay. Enough of an introduction from me. I will ask Katherine and tell us who you are and
hello, everyone. I'm Katherine Oliver. I'm a lecturer at the University of Oxford, and this is I'm afraid my childcare fell through. So this is our youngest delegate. So my area of...
Let's get us all to introduce ourselves, and then we'll come back to you.
Okay.
Claire.
So, hello, everyone. Well done on getting to this point, everybody. I think we've got a sustainability challenge in a turbulent last hour. So, my name's Claire Matteson. Last 18 years, I've been at the Wellcome Trust as Director of Strategy, Director of Culture and Society, and Head of Policy. And now I am a special advisor on an initiative called Our Planet, Our Health, because I think it's important, because it took me back to some of my sort of zoology roots, and because I'd had enough after 18 years of sitting in executive board meetings. So I'm very excited about this agenda.
Great. Andy.
Hi, everyone. My name's Andy Sterling. I'm at the Science Policy Research Unit and the STEP Centre at Sussex University. And I am one of the cabal of people who was part of making the Nexus Network do its thing. And I'm interested in the politics and power in science, technology, and innovation.
Hi, I'm Deepawali from Nepal. I'm an academic. I do my research in what I call area of society-technology interface. Does it fit like this or go like this? And most of the time it goes like this. I used to be a minister for water resources. These days I spend most of my time making the lives of other ministers miserable, asking uncomfortable questions.
That, ladies and gentlemen, is our panel. And I'm going to start off by asking Claire to say a few words.
Okay, so I wanted to talk about a slightly different boundary that has popped its head up a little bit today. But I find it interesting that we still, when we talk about boundaries, we still sit in our different silos. So I'm going to talk about the nexus, if you like, a different nexus, which is for some One Health, for some planetary health. So coming from Wellcome Trust, which is all about sort of advancements in human health, Wellcome Trust sort of came to the realisation a number of years ago, and there was a big 2015 Lancet Commission called Planetary Health, realising that, if you like, we've sort of mortgaged the future of the health mortgaged the health of future generations, if you like, by at the expense of the planet and exploiting the resources of the planet of today. And if we're not careful, the great health gains that we have realised will be lost in sort of decades to come because we haven't looked after that greatest resource, which is our planet. So there is a definition around planetary health, around health of human civilizations, the state of the planet upon which they depend. But I think it's not helpful to start going too much into definitions. There's geo-health, there's One Health. But I think what's really important here for me is it's that nexus between health, public health, environment, but actually, and what we've been talking about today, how that interacts with the economic, the social and cultural, but then also this equity issue, both in terms of equity today, but actually the equity in terms of future generations, and how from a research perspective, and then how from a kind of cross-sectoral perspective, can we actually make a difference. The Lancet Commission basically in 2015 put three big buckets, if you like, of challenges together. One big bucket was around the challenge of research and information, and we've heard quite a lot today about new types of research, interdisciplinary research. We know it's difficult, we know there are lots of still structural difficulties to get that going. Wellcome Trust put 75 million into this new Our Planet, Our Health initiative, and we've been aiming to fund a number of large sort of new initiatives in that space around food and food systems, around urbanisation and health, but always trying to think how do we get health, environment, economics, social, publics, etc. in that. And it's not been easy or straightforward, but there are efforts to do that. So in a way there is, if you look back from 2005, there's a sort of a bit of a tick in that box in terms of how, if you like, the research in the academic community is trying to push that forward. The other big challenge was what they called sort of challenges of imagination. And if you look at the report, that really is about how can we redesign economic systems, health systems, to actually think differently about how we put these things together. And once again, we've heard there are many initiatives, and you can pull different initiatives out. They don't always pull all of these things together, and often, interestingly, health is missed out from that agenda. So I sort of give that a kind of half mark almost in terms of how, from my perspective, a planetary health perspective, things are going. And the last one that they put in the bucket was called sort of challenge of sort of governance and sort of institutions. And to my mind, I think that is where there is the biggest failure. We haven't transformed our governance systems. We've talked a lot about sort of behaviour and the need for behaviour change. We don't really have enough understanding of how we move those forward. So I looked back at those 2015 recommendations, and there are 12 of them, and I've given it 5.5 out of 12 in terms of where we are today. And so I guess the question is, if we think maybe I'm a sort of cup half full, maybe that's not too bad after sort of 2-3 years in terms of what was a sort of important report for a call of arms to the health community to get to be part of this agenda. But how can we do that extra sort of 6.5 and sort of push forward? And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Katherine.
Okay, thanks. Over the last sort of 10, 15 years, interest in the relationship between research, evidence and policy has been growing, not as a discipline and a sort of research area in its own right. And one of the pieces of work which I've done contributing to that field was a big review a few years ago looking at the different factors which influence the uptake of research into policy. And many of them will be very familiar to people in this room, including things like accessibility, timing, resources, but really fundamentally relationships and sort of collaboration and contact between researchers and policymakers is what comes out of the literature as being really vital in thinking about how to increase the uptake of evidence into policymaking. And one of the ways in which that is being done is through the use of brokers and boundary spanners, both at an individual level and a sort of organisational, structural level. But really, fundamentally, we don't understand yet what kinds of brokers and boundary spanners are effective, or what kinds of structures and organisations are really good at promoting relationships, or even what kind of relationships sort of work to try and improve collaboration and co-production. We also don't really know what effective uptake of evidence looks like. So that's another sort of outstanding question for the field. So how to better understand the interface between research and policy? I think, at the risk of sounding like a classic academic, I'm afraid more research is needed. You can think about knowledge brokerage and boundary spanning as a sort of set of interventions in its own right. One way would be to look at what universities do, and other organisations. So what kinds of collaborative and co-productive structures are existing at the moment. Health has a lot of really good examples of collaborative organisations and initiatives to promote boundary spanning. So, for example, the Collaborations for Leadership in Applied Healthcare Research. The Clarks are a really good example of that, where clinicians, patients, researchers all work together to come up with a research agenda, to carry out the research and then to implement it and evaluate it. But there's outstanding questions about what universities can do to incentivise researchers to take part in that space and to be happy about engaging. Another way we can sort of approach the question of what boundary spanners can or should do is to look at what researchers do. And a number of colleagues, including myself, so Paul Kearney, Warren Pearce, are sort of working on a project at the moment looking at what we can learn from political studies, from political sciences about how researchers move into the political space. And one sort of rule that political studies say will be helpful to researchers when trying to engage in policy making is to sort of try and learn who the key actors are, where the key points of change in any system are, at any level, which stage, and which sort of point of governance, and to really try and engage in long-term strategies, get to know the key people who are going to be important over the next few years, learn about upcoming agendas and so on and so forth. But the thing to remember is that this involves choices. And I think what's going to be really important in this space over the next few years particularly is to be really careful about being explicit about what choices researchers are making when they move into that space and the implications of those choices. So, for example, we might have really good evidence, trial-based evidence, that a particular intervention is very effective. But how do we prioritise that over local decision-making capabilities? How far should researchers go to try and convince policymakers to really stick to the sort of the manual-based intervention, and how far should we allow people to move away from what the evidence base says is effective towards what local needs are? And how far should researchers engage in using storytelling and emotional appeals to try and convince people? We know that that's really the most effective way to win an argument. You can see that from political debate generally. But that puts researchers in a very exposed place, and a place which many of us will feel very uncomfortable. So even if we know we have a point we wish to make and an argument which we wish to win, should we engage in those kinds of what many will regard as being manipulation in order to do that? And this really takes us towards a sort of area where Roger Pilkey and people like that have been working for a long time, thinking about the honest broker. Is this a role which scientists should adopt? Should we be out there trying to come up with political options, trying to engage in a political debate and really presenting policymakers with a set of choices for them to make, a sort of menu of political options, if you like? Or should we be taking a more hands-off view and trying to sort of just evangelise about our own research and the evidence base itself? And I don't think there are any easy answers to that. So one answer to the sort of problem of this power sharing has been co-production, and this is very popular at the moment in public policy, and particularly in public health and health policy. And what it really means is the evidence base is gathered together, and then a set of relevant stakeholders have a conversation about what that evidence really means. But it hasn't solved the problem of how the power is shared within that space. So yes, we're having a conversation, but how do we weight the particular inputs of the researcher, the evidence space, the expert, the user, the patient, the professional and the policymaker and so on? Is it going to come down to group dynamics? Is it going to come down to long-standing social structures? We haven't solved these problems yet. And I think the three main things that I would like us to consider in this discussion are that, first of all, for researchers to wish to go out there and become boundary spanners and brokers of their evidence, we need to be really clear and transparent about the choices that we are making as academics and as researchers in order to do that. We need to recognise that conflict is basically not avoidable. Chantal Mouffe writes about the violence which is inevitable in public deliberation. And what she means isn't sort of, a big scrap. What she means is there's never going to be an answer which pleases everybody. And a lot of the debate around evidence-based policy and practice kind of masks that by assuming that there is an answer which will solve this problem. And I think we need to recognise that's not always going to be the case. And finally, to look at the underlying structures which promote the production of knowledge as well as those which are associated with using it. So look at which research is funded, who has a say, and what research is available, and how that influences what's used as well as what's there. Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine. That's a really good summary. Thank you. Andy.
Thanks. Yeah, well, I'm actually going to pick up, Catherine's very nicely outlined the key issues, and I want to pick up on the question that you included, Katherine, in your discussion. How far should we allow people to depart from the evidence? And you've addressed several of the implications of that very well, but I'm going to do so by reference to the way the session is framed, evidence-informed policy, which is a very familiar phrase in these circles. And Nigel, you introduced it as a counterpoint with the expert-hating Gove sort of in the corner. And actually, for a guy from Sussex with a ponytail and what passes for a beard, I'm going to give more serious respect and attention to the Gove critique than might be expected. And I'm going to do so by just trying to say raising questions, but actually trying to say something practical about each of the three words, evidence-informed policy, and hopefully feed into discussion that way. So evidence about what? So the normal way in Nexus circles that this is addressed is, well, evidence about the facts of food, energy, water interactions as objective systems out there in the world. What are the facts? And although it's obvious that the uncertainties are at least as salient as the facts, already it tends to be a sense that, well, don't talk too much about the uncertainties because that's not convenient for policy making in ways that has been outlined. So it's also, of course, evidence about uncertainties, and already that gets lost. But beyond that, I think, to take it seriously and address the critique, not least from we heard in the voice of Michael Gove, is evidence about the subjective ways, not just about the objects of food, energy, water, and air interactions, but evidence about the subjective ways in which those can legitimately be looked at or framed, and what the implications are when you do that. So, for instance, transgenic foods, key in Nexus debates, water-stressed environments, pressures also for energy demand. Is it evidence about food safety that's really salient? That's often where, as far as it goes. Or ecological integrity, or the cultures of food, or relations with nature, or alternative ways of addressing food and agronomic systems. Not just about GM, yes or no, but about the range of choices. Now, each one of those different subjective perspectives will yield radically different implications about what the key messages are, what the evidence is about. Informed, in which ways? Now, it's great, actually, the question's framed evidence-informed, because already that's getting beyond what is still actually in many government departments in the UK and bodies like the WTO in the very high-stakes trade negotiations. It's evidence-based. But even the word informed raises some of the same questions. It moves away from the rigid determinism of evidence-based policy, which can be understood very intelligently in different ways, but tends to mean the policy based on the evidence. The policy that is the base for the evidence of the base for the policy. And I think that one thing that the evidence tells us after decades, centuries even of experience in this area, is that policy, no single policy can be uniquely, definitively based on evidence. In fact, it's an oxymoron, evidence-based policy in that sense. And that evidence always speaks, when it's policy relevant, always speaks with more than one voice, and any view from whatever side of the political spectrum that tries to present it otherwise should be a matter for some concern. So, for instance, in the energy sector, arguably the best documented of any sector we're looking at in this field, it's routinely the case that different peer-reviewed studies using risk assessment or cost-benefit analysis, ecosystem services, can in fact yield different ranking orders for different energy strategies based on the same body of science, depending on how that science is framed. And then the final, the implication of that practically then is about humility, which we discussed really nicely earlier on, about phrases like the phrase we heard, doing the math. Do the math. And of course, maths and evidence are very important and they're crucial to robust decision-making, but actually the idea that, and it's not what the phrase meant this morning, that you only get crank out one answer, is what I think requires a little bit of humility. If we want to avoid provoking Gove-like, Trump-like, Brexit-like reactions to technocratic expertise. And then so finally, it's policy, if I've got a minute or so. Yeah. Yes, of course, policy is crucial. It's absolutely admirable what policy making has to do, the way it deals with the contending pressures. But is it always all about policy or also about politics? And I think we tend to forget the extent to which really effectively addressing Nexus challenges is at least as much about politics as policy. So we have this sense that, we heard this morning, for instance, and again, I absolutely sympathise with the plea to be practical so you can engage with these beleaguered people involved in policy-making circles, and I don't intend to denigrate that. But we heard that if you want to be practical and change the world, come to a ministry. I once got told off for facial expressions, actually, at a conference, but I mean, it doesn't imply any disrespect to question that phrase, and that if we look at the history of transformation, progressive transformations that might inform our thinking about these challenges of the Nexus, emancipation of colonies, of workers, of women, of different sexualities, the advent of the welfare state and of democracy itself, it's difficult to tell those stories from whatever perspective and find it's a matter of effective informing policy. It's politics. And I think a key message which we've heard a number of times at this conference is actually that's really the key role for evidence as well. So how then practically can we inform politics as much as policy? I would say avoid these pressures for closure. One can understand them to deliver just one answer from the evidence. And instead, it's pretty much any method we use can be used to say, if you assume X, then A. If you assume Y, then B. And even if you only go as far as that, you break this lock-in that there's no room for politics of the kind that arguably provokes the reactions that we're lamenting in different circles. So in some ways, less is more. Less assertiveness can gain more trust. In other words, more trust of people can gain more trust of expertise. It's a reciprocal relationship, not just trusting power, but power trusting those who are more marginalized. So that, I think there are practical implications, and on GM, again, you can see that there are different bodies of science that inform policy making around the Nexus. It's not just about a single science-based policy. It's about being explicit about different understandings of science, different interests, intellectual property, different supply chains lead to different choices. So I think it's quite a practical prescription to make. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Okay, as somebody representing the Global South, I hope to bring a very different lens here. I'll talk about three things. One, evidence and policy. Second, about what is turbulent times. And third, about something about innovation. Now, the first thing is, when we talk evidence, the first thing that leaps at us is whose evidence, how was that evidence generated, for what purpose, and more important, what were the kind of evidences that were filtered out, and how have they come back to bite? Example, the World Bank and its project in my country, our own 3 celebrated campaign. I was part of that. You know, you ask them and they say, oh, well, environment. It had nothing to do with the environment. It had nothing to do with social resettlement. There was no resettlement. This is a project up in the hills where nobody lived. Okay, why did it happen? Bad economics by the World Bank. Building a project which could be built at less than $1,000 per kilowatt at $5,400 per kilowatt. And it brings me back to a book just out here from Nicholas Hildyard called Licensed Larceny, and that's precisely what it was. And that's where activism came in. Okay? So the question then becomes, policy, you know, I'm a little bit disturbed when I hear the word policy, and I'm glad you raised that, because policy, the word policy kind of sanitizes the politics. You know, policy is really about the formula for the use of power. What kind of power and how much of it do you enjoy? Bureaucracies, armies, they enjoy coercive power and procedural power. It's procedures that tames coercive power. Markets enjoy persuasive power. And most of the good activist NGOs or civic movements enjoy moral power. Okay. They don't have the other two. Now, you see that when any one of them is excluded, you land in trouble. And the biggest example for us is when we all talk of PPPs, public-private partnerships and all that. Now, public-private partnership is a disaster simply because it should have been PPCP, public-private civic partnership, and civic has been left out completely. And so what has happened in most of the global south is that the public has been subsumed under the private. It's massive private sector taking over functions that were really public, the redistribution function and all that, okay? So we're talking about turbulent times, and this is what our whole session is all about. Now, I understand with Brexit and Mr. Trump, the turbulent times washing to these shores, but some of us have been living with turbulent times since right from the 40s and 50s. And it's non-stop. Go to the Middle East. It's been turbulent all the time. We're going through tremendous turbulence, but when you look at it globally, what you see is from the end of the Second World War till about 1973 was that kind of a period of golden age of capitalism, you might say. People who look back nostalgically before the first oil shock. And what there was and why it was so productive was because governments had control over the finances. They could decide their interest rates, they could do all kinds of things. Slowly after 1973 till about 1990 with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and Soviet Union, it was eroded, but not as fast as since the 1990s. The last time after the 1990s, it's been complete PPP with the public being subsumed under the private. Now, it's essentially, to use Karl Polanyi's language, it's not market serving society, but society serving the market, totally. Okay. And now what is happening is society is reacting back. Whether it is all your migrants coming in, wherever there are jobs, nobody is going to migrate to Africa to find a job, they'll come to Europe to find a job, or the United States. Okay. So this is what has been the result of destroying governments in the global south, making them wholly ineffective, putting entire countries, entire societies under the market chopping block. Okay? And to bring back another thinker besides Karl Polanyi, this historian Stavrianos, whose amazing book on what's called the global rift. It's not about a history of his historian, but it's not about the history of any particular country or a region. It was the history of the process of third worldization. How did it happen? And one of the key things he talks about is how trade moves from trade in luxuries to trade in necessities and the control over those necessities. Now, this is what is happening with the kind of economic development we are facing, or one-sided development, where market societies have been put under the chopping block of the market, sacrificed on that altar. So now when we talk of innovation and new ideas and new thinking, again, I have a problem that often innovation is always seen as these fancy iPads and iPhones and all that sort of stuff. Those are technical innovations, and markets are the best to do that. You can't think of a government bureaucracy doing those innovations, okay? That's fine, but that's so very partial. What we really need are also managerial innovations. And that's where government should be coming in. Unfortunately, we've destroyed our governments who can do no managerial innovation. Somebody in the morning mentioned, where governments are trying to solve today's 21st century problem with 19th century ideas. Well, new challenges need very different managerial solutions, managerial innovations, and we are not seeing enough of that in governments because governments have been destroyed. And finally, that's also not enough. We've got to have behavioral innovations. And those behavioral innovations will not come from the market, will not really come from governments. It has to come from civic movements, because these are questions of ethical values. And those value systems have to come from people who are not in the business of coercive control or in the business of profit and markets and blandishments. So this is where I think we really need to rethink our whole innovation and policy and evidence. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I think 4 passionate speakers, and now we have a short opportunity for some questions. I'm going to look particularly at people who I don't think have already asked questions before. And all the people who have their hands up have already asked questions, as far as I can see. So let's have somebody who hasn't, please. Yeah, you in the blue shirt?
Sure, I'm just waiting for the mic.
I trust that you haven't asked a question before. Good. And you can't now because the microphone, this roving microphone is not working, please.
Hello. Is that working now? Okay.
Yeah.
I promise I haven't asked a question up until now. My name is David Bent. I'm an associate fellow at the Centre for Science and Policy in Cambridge. I guess my question is, so we're in this turbulent times, and I suppose I feel inspired by, I think his name is Michael Young, who in the 50s and 60s was a serial social entrepreneur and set up institution after institution that became a way of carrying UK forward. Things like the Open University, things like the Consumer Association. So in the service of whether it's of the spanning function or whatever other functions you think we need, what are the institutions we can establish now that will lead to a successful UK in a sustainable world?
Who would, the panel would like to respond to that? Anybody?
Well, very quickly, because I'm sure a lot of people got things to say to it. It's a great question. I'd say don't forget democracy. It's not a single institution, it's a set. It's not just about representation and voting, it's about the capacities to challenge power. And for me, the implication of the things I said and about the importance of politics rather than just policy is democracy in all the ways in which all the different kinds of power can be challenged. They are the ways in which societies, informed by evidence, find their way through these challenges. So it's a whole set of institutions and practices, but they are the most important to me.
Anyone else on the panel want to respond? Claire?
I'm not going to respond in the context of the UK, because actually I think it's a bigger question that. But for me, I think it's kind of taking some of the basic ingredients, but then trying to do it differently. So what we've just embarked on is a new relationship, setting up a new foundation, and we don't even know foundation is the right word because that suggests it gives out money, but we couldn't think of a good word, where we've got a sort of environmental academic partner, got Wellcome coming in with some, with a sort of health side, and then a partner which comes much more from the business side. It's actually somebody who has made considerable money from hotel chains and really cares about food. And so those three have come together, bringing very different expertise, all with a vision about sustainable and healthy food systems, accessible, affordable for everybody, but actually bringing very, very different expertise and trying out very, very different things to see. So working with chefs or working with cities to see if we can actually just do things differently, because it just seems like some of the existing models don't really work. We don't know if we're going to succeed, but we're giving it a try.
Let's have another question from somebody who hasn't already asked a question. I see the gentleman with the beard, yes?
Hello, thank you. My name is Chris Ives. I'm from the School of Geography at the University of Nottingham. My question, quite simply, is whether you think it is separating between facts and values is a useful or an unhelpful thing to do in navigating the science policy interface, and indeed whether it's even possible.
Yeah, you're never going to be able to separate it. Like I said, what kind of science you're doing depends on where you're coming from. Are you a market scientist working for Coca-Cola? Are you a government scientist working for a particular government and within the narrow confines of what a government policy are? Or are you one of those, a Greenpeace scientist? You're going to be asking very different questions about the same so-called problem. And how you define that problem is going to be very, very different where you're coming from. So it's better, I think, to actually make it explicit and admit that you are coming from these very different angles, and therefore your questions are very different. Therefore, your definition of what the problem is very different. If we can manage to do that, then we get to what Andy has just said about democracy. What we are having right now is one or the other is being pushed off the table. And it's a hegemonic voice that kind of determines what evidence is, determines what policy should be, and so on. So I think this is where the problem is. Let's admit that it can never be separated.
I mean, it's the million-dollar question in a lot of ways, isn't it? And I think I completely agree with what the other panellists have said. I think the best that we can do is recognise the vested interests which are part of the conversation in producing knowledge, in driving forward the research system and being part of setting research agendas. And one of the reasons I'm really interested in collaboration and co-production is because it tries to make that explicit, and you can really look at sort of processes that are going on. And in answer to the previous question as well, one of the interesting things that health does is it does set up a number of these kinds of initiatives. So, for example, the James Lind Alliance was set up explicitly to involve patients, carers, consumers together in a conversation with practitioners to develop research agendas about different conditions. And it would be great to see that set up and increase civic engagement across different areas, including sort of the Nexus policy areas.
I have, yes, the lady in green. Yes.
It's a point and then a question. Coming from the sort of the policy side, having done that, I think it's important to distinguish between, Andrea Westall, different hats. I'm going to put the policy hat on for this question. There's a difference between specific policies, which can come from anywhere. So it's quite hard to identify how you get into that process. And that will come to the question I'm going to ask. And the second one is what I call more the system policies. So when you're looking at cities, looking at local economic development, energy systems, etc., and the relationship there, I think, is different, because that is probably about good enough evidence, which is hard, I think, sometimes to say we've just got to go with what we have at a time. It can change over time. Very different understanding there of what evidence-based policy could be. But I think just back to that first point about specific policies, yes, it'd be great if one could identify the points of intervention from the research side. But to take Andy's point, if we're talking about democracy, an informed democracy is what we want. So my question to everyone really is, how can a lot of the research that's there be made more accessible so that it can be then picked up and inform those places which at the moment it is difficult to articulate where they'll be, but which are powerful in making that change?
Who would like to respond to that challenge? Claire.
Kick off. I mean, it's a really good question, and it's sort of some of the issues that were being raised earlier about sort of the roles and responsibilities, and what is the role and responsibility, if you like, of the researcher, the sort of scientist, say, sitting in an academic institution. I think there is a responsibility for academic institutions to address and think about their engagement strategy. I don't think that necessarily means every single researcher or every single scientist always has to be doing engagement, but I do think that there needs to be a very explicit thought about what is the strategy of the institution, how does the institution support people across the different range of issues, and some of them might be contentious science, some of them might be much more around sort of building and opening up questions, and having a clear framework and understanding of the type of engagement and the purposes by which one might go about it. Whether is it just informing and educating? Is it genuinely trying to be collaborative? Is it actually just trying to open some dialogue to really advance some thinking? I don't think. I mean, I think the sophistication of that thought process in institutions is increasing and improving, but I still think we've got quite a long way to go to actually get it all the way through the institutions.
Yeah, and a couple of other comments from panel members, and then I think we turn into pumpkins, or we go in network. So
I'm already turning into a pumpkin, I think. Great question. I think this is an area, communication between science and wider society, where what I tried to say about not just speaking truth to power, but speaking about power, speaking about the way in which power works in science, in innovation, Because so often the etiquette, the polite policy etiquette, is to pretend that science and even innovation are airbrushed of power, that they are somehow delivered by the Enlightenment progressive sort of force of science. And power is not necessarily a bad thing. Usually when you get as far as I've just got, then people say, well, Andy, it's not a bad thing. No, but we should speak about it, because power becomes bad when we don't speak about it. So in the answer to the specific question about communication of science, recognize that the reason that it's a poor old bench scientist, the least powerful scientists, who are externalized onto to have the responsibility of engaging, when actually it's about decision-makings on the directions of science and technology that are really at stake. But so often powerful institutions in science externalize onto the scientists, saying you must talk to the public. When what actually this is about is a political deliberation and contestation about the directions taken by science. So for me, it's a communication two-way, with science recognized to be embedded in a Polanyi sense in society and having to be accountable in ways that make it more robust.
I think it's important for scientists and researchers to start concentrating on what in other business terms and development we call middlemen. You are not going to, scientists and researchers can never properly access politicians. A politician does not read scientific papers. You're lucky if they read the morning editorials. I have known prime ministers who have never read anything and who got all their information from 5 o'clock in the morning from their closest confidant via the ear directly. Okay. Now, if we have, as scientists and researchers, not really concentrated on that middleman, which is the press. It's the only profession I know outside of politicians which is really nexused. They have to think across disciplines by their very nature. But unfortunately, much of the media in the global south is a disaster now. And I understand it's a disaster here also. They couldn't predict Trump and they couldn't predict anything else. But it's too corporate owned now. Media has become completely corporatized. The space for these civic voices are being lost. Even government views are not really coming through the media to the public. It's being mediated by a very corporate sort of interest that filters out non-media interest things. So scientists really have to learn how to cultivate that middle media ground to be able to who are more capable of translating those evidences and scientific research to policy in a language that the policy folks would understand.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you all, the audience, especially our panel, even including our youngest member who said very little, fortunately. I'd also like to take this opportunity, which is not on the programme, to thank the organisers, the people who put all of this together. And there are a lot of them, and I don't have a long list, but I think you probably have seen all of them. It's been a fantastic conference, and I think we all owe them a huge debt of gratitude. So to our organisers and to our panel. And lastly, to you all, and you now get your reward. Oh, Rose, what?
Can I just encourage everyone? We've had a really talented illustrator at the back throughout the conference who's been magically drawing while people have been speaking, and I think what she's captured is really amazing. So can I encourage you to all have a quick look at the back, either before or after you've had a drink?
Okay. Yeah. We have...
sorry, just a quick announcement. My name is Henry Lusengor, and one hat I wear is Chief Executive of Promoting Economic Pluralism. And we've talked about co-production of knowledge. Well, we're organising with a range of people, the Green Economy Coalition, the Tax Justice Network, the Finance Watch, New Economics Foundation, a range of organisations, academics and so forth, an international co-production knowledge over 18 months, starting in September at the RSA to mark 10 years after the crash. And we're using the crash events over an 18-month period to actually create an international movement to ask questions about the fundamentals of the economic systems we have, what we've learned or haven't learned from that experience, and how we need to build new ways of understanding and organising the economy, including sustainability, equality, and so on. It is a growing movement. We've got networks in the US, Australia, India, China, Brazil, and so on. And so I'd really invite you to be part of that in whatever place that you are that makes sense, apart from anything being at the RSA event, which will be 4 days of events in September, starting with 9/11, quite interestingly. Thanks very much. And I do apologise.
Thank you. Thank you, Henry. It sounds fascinating. So see you all there. Thank you very much.